With the exciting news that the upcoming Godzilla vs Kong movie has been pushed forward to next month, I thought it was fitting to discuss the predecessor to this film. No, I'm not talking about the reinterpretations of these characters in recent years, I'm talking about the originals and especially the 1963 trailblazer that was called King Kong vs Godzilla. Way before Kevin Feige assembled the Marvel Cinematic Universe and shared universes became the norm for all movies, 1963 saw what could arguably be seen as a bigger moment in the history of cinema. The American-owned King Kong and the Japanese-owned Godzilla sharing the same screen for the first time. Two entities that never coexisted in previous iterations coming together in one grandstand movie. America and Japan forming a super team to make this film possible. But how did this happen? How did two film studios from two different continents come together to make this statement of a movie? To figure that out, we must go on a history lesson of both kaijus. How did King Kong become the eighth wonder of the world that then inspired the monsters to rule them all, Godzilla? This is King Kong vs Godzilla, the movie you've never seen. The original King Kong was released in 1933 in what was called pre-code Hollywood, basically a time between the 1920s and 1930s that saw many filmmakers break Hollywood codes regarding sexual innuendos, mild profanity, illegal drug use, and much more. King Kong was released during this time and was directed and produced by Merian C. Cooper and Ernest B. Schoedsack. The film's story follows filmmaker Carl Denham, who tricks the film crew and actress Ann Darrow to follow him on an adventure to Skull Island where he can locate a colossal ape named King Kong. But as we progress further into the movie, we realise that Kong isn't a violent brute, but a caring animal. King Kong comes under the jungle genre of movies, which was the craze in the early 20s and 30s. Director Merian Cooper even directed a jungle movie himself, the controversial Inagi, released in 1930. But before that, there were films such as 1918's Tarzan of the Apes and 1925's The Lost World. The fascination with the jungle genre or even apes far preceded Merian's first film Inagi. Before he even directed King Kong, he originally pitched an idea to Paramount Pictures about an African gorilla battling it out with a giant Komodo dragon. Sounds a bit like a Godzilla vs Kong movie, right? But it was the Great Depression and Paramount Pictures wasn't willing to finance what seemed a very expensive movie. Fast forward a few years and Merian Cooper finds himself working for RKO Pictures, and after working on a few projects with the studio, he gets the green light to film his 8th movie, minus the Komodo dragon. And thus begins the merry-go-round of writers that would eventually script what we now know as King Kong. A total of 5 different writers, including Merian himself, would rewrite the original script penned by Edgar Wallace, eventually leading to Ernest Schoedsack's wife, Ruth Rose, to pen the final draft. And so, on March 23, 1933, King Kong was released, with no hiccups. Well, not necessarily. By the time the film was about to be released, pre-code Hollywood had died, and the strict nature of the production code began to squirm their way into the movie. Even after the film was released with no major cuts, the authorities at the production code subsequently censored the film further. Scenes such as a brontosaurus mauling crewmen in the water, or Kong biting and stepping on natives when he attacks the village, and a few more were cut from the movie. This meant for many decades the original scenes were lost, but with the help of Universal Studios and Warner Brothers, over the years the film slowly had those removed scenes added back in. 1933's King Kong is still regarded as a cinematic milestone, receiving rave reviews when it came out and many years later, with a 98% approval rating on Rotten Tomatoes. King Kong was a huge success. The highly popular King Kong not only made headways in America, that success travelled to Japan, as they were beginning to come up with their own monster. Producer of Godzilla, Tomoyuki Tanaka, knew that King Kong, which was then re-released overseas by 1955, was a huge hit that could be replicated in Japan. Coupled with the success of another monster movie, The Beast from 20,000 Fathoms became the starting point for Tanaka. But it wasn't just King Kong that helped push the idea of Godzilla. The creation of the King of Monsters was down to right timing and current circumstances surrounding Japan. In 1955, Japan had a huge national panic. This was due to 23 Japanese fishermen that went out on sea and unknowingly came very close to the US hydrogen bomb test in the South Pacific, leading to the men on that boat to become seriously ill. There began a nationwide discussion about atomic weapons, with some Japanese citizens likening this event to the bombing of Hiroshima. Japan was a country that was slowly recovering from the impact of World War II, and this event was a scary reminder about the dangers of atomic weapons. With this in mind, Tomoyuki Tanaka began the idea of a Japanese monster movie that had anti-nuclear themes. as shown by the idea that Godzilla was awakened by nuclear testing.
ゴジラなる代物が水爆の実験が生んだ落とし子であるなどという。その通りじゃないか。そうだ。
And the person to direct this film was Ishiro Honda. He wasn't Toho Studios' first choice in directing Godzilla, but he was the only one that apparently took the concept seriously and had a fascination with the idea. Coupled with Honda also having experience on the front lines in World War II, seemed to be the perfect choice for a movie about nuclear disaster. With a director in place, it was then down to making the small idea in Tomoyuki Tanaka's head a reality, and so he hired sci-fi writer Shigeru Kayama to expand the story. And 11 days later and only 50 pages written, Kayama's story treatment was then taken over by Ishiro Honda and fellow screenwriter Takeo Murata. They both began to work on the treatment by locking themselves away for 3 weeks to flesh out Kayama's story. The original story by Kayama had Godzilla acting more like King Kong and also featured far less destruction by the monster, but with Honda and Murata at the helm, the story began to flourish, characters were redeveloped and slight changes were made to make sure Godzilla became the destructing chaos that we know today. So, on November 3rd, 1954, Godzilla was released, but it wasn't met with high praise. Godzilla had mixed reviews, with some Japanese critics lamenting the film by claiming it was exploiting the devastation caused in World War II and the Boeing incident with the fishermen. But just like many films, it would take years for Godzilla to get recognition for his anti-nuclear story. So the question becomes, how did the American-produced King Kong, released in 1933, and the Japanese-produced Godzilla, released in 1954, come together to make the 1963 crossover? Now that we are caught up with the history of these two behemoth monsters, it's time to talk about King Kong vs Godzilla. The film had 2 releases, one for Japan and the Asian market, and the other for America and the rest of the world. But before getting into why the film had 2 separate release dates, we need to know how this film was conceived. The film idea originally came from the head of the 1933 stop-motion animator for King Kong, Willis O'Brien, but instead of Kong facing Japan's fierce kaiju, O'Brien wanted Kong to fight Frankenstein's monster. To help him expand that story, O'Brien then hired screenwriter George Worthing Yates to turn his story treatment into a fully fledged screenplay. But O'Brien couldn't find backing for his film. RKO, the studio who made the original King Kong, was no longer a production company, so couldn't finance a movie, but after meeting producer John Beck, the script finally found a home. Toho Studio, the company who had the rights to Godzilla, was the interested party. Toho was looking to release a slate of high quality movies for their 30th anniversary, and the prospect of having King Kong in a Godzilla movie was too good to refuse. But just like any Hollywood story, sleaziness ensued and John Beck sold the script to Toho behind Willis O'Brien's back, meaning O'Brien never got any credit for the initial idea. Toho then rewrote the script with the help of Shinichi Sekizawa and replaced Frankenstein's monster with King Kong, getting the rights from RKO. However, even more controversy emerged, with Merian C. Cooper, the man who originally came up with King Kong, being outraged by the idea of his creation fighting Godzilla, and began a barrage of accusations against RKO, claiming he had sole ownership to the character. But Merian could never prove that he had sole rights to Kong, only proving at the time he had publishing rights to the character, such as in comic books, but not films. So production continued, and for the film itself, veteran filmmaker and director of the first Godzilla movie, Ishiro Honda, came back to direct the movie. This would become the first Godzilla to be released after 1955's Godzilla raids, meaning the fierce monster had a 7-year hiatus from the cinemas of Japan. Now, I said earlier that the film had 2 separate release dates. That is because when John Beck sold the script to Toho, Toho gave him exclusive rights to produce a version of the film for non-Asian territories. This is why the movie had 2 different release dates. John Beck would then go hire Hollywood writers Paul Mason and Bruce Howard to write a new screenplay for the film. And to make it more Americanized, they decided to insert new footage that would have an American newscaster to dictate the narrative, thus subsequently cutting most of the human drama from the original Japanese story. The person to direct the new American scenes would be Thomas Montgomery. So, what was the story? I can only go by what I saw in the Americanized version of the movie. The plot goes that the head of a Pacific pharmaceutical company, Mr. Tako, is frustrated by the ratings of a television show his company is sponsoring. To try and change that, Mr. Tako has an idea that will shake up the scene and to boost ratings. He wants a monster to gain publicity.
It's heads, so get a monster.
To get his monster, he sends 2 men, Osamu Sakurai and Kensaburo Furu, to find one. But instead of finding King Kong at Skull Island, these 2 find Kong on Faroe Island. They begin to bring the creature back, but a government order means they cannot cross into Japanese seas, with Kong attached along. However, Kong escapes. Godzilla, on the other hand, continues from where the creature lays off in the previous film, Godzilla Raids Again. The monster escapes from the ice tomb from the previous film, and both Godzilla and Kong slowly move towards each other like two opposite ends of a magnet, and then a big battle happens once they meet. This is obviously a very condensed version of the story. The Americanized King Kong vs Godzilla cost roughly $15,500 and was then sold to Universal International for about $200,000 and released on April 29, 1963. The film in Japan, which was released a year earlier in 1962, was a huge success, becoming the highest grossing movie of the franchise at the time. Because of that, Toho was going to make another one that had Godzilla pitted against the original monster for the film, Frankenstein's monster, but that idea was shelved. The studio even wanted to make a sequel with a Mecha Kong like Mecha Godzilla, but the ownership rights for the character of King Kong at that point became very messy. So instead, Toho went in favour of Godzilla fighting monsters they had already introduced in solo movies. Unfortunately, due to poor preservation, the original Japanese cut of King Kong vs Godzilla was heavily damaged, and for many decades the film has tried to be spliced together again so that the true Japanese version can be watched. There have been many attempts to get a release as close as possible to the original, but due to lost or damaged film, it has only been attempted but never close to the 1962 cinema release. The American version is available and can be fully seen. So why is the 1962 or 63, depending on who you ask, King Kong vs Godzilla important? It is important because of the sheer craziness of the idea. To put an American-owned character in King Kong and a Japanese-owned character in Godzilla together way back in the early 60s is impressive. It is now the norm to see characters from different films or film franchises converging into one movie, but the sheer audacity to pit a character as iconic as King Kong even back then and Godzilla, which kept growing in stature, was ballsy. So it might not be the best movie, but I just loved that it happened, and it paved the way for 2021's release. So, in conclusion, King Kong vs Godzilla is one of cinema's landmark movie moments. One that revitalized the character of Godzilla and started a huge legal battle over who actually owned King Kong. And I will say this, before you watch 2021's version, go and watch the original King Kong vs Godzilla, the movie you've never seen.